There is a set of clay tablets in the Mesopotamian Gallery of the British Museum in London. They are brown, roughly 14 centimetres across, and covered in tiny wedge-shaped impressions pressed into the clay when it was still wet. Somewhere around 3,700 years ago, the tablets are broken, several pieces are missing. What remains has been reassembled over the course of more than a century by scholars working in basement offices in London, Philadelphia, and New Haven. The text they carry is called the Atrahasis. It is written in Akkadian, the lingua franca of ancient Mesopotamia, and it tells a story that predates every book in the Western biblical tradition by more than 1,000 years. The story has 3 acts. In the first, a group of beings called the Anunnaki arrive and set the lower gods to work. In the second, the lower gods rebel, and a new creature, a human, is engineered to replace them. In the third, the Anunnaki decide to destroy what they have made, but not all of them agree, and what happened in the gap between that disagreement and the flood that followed, what the tablets say about why the engineers left and why the engineered could not follow, is one of the strangest and most under-discussed passages in the entire corpus of ancient Near Eastern literature. The Atrahasis tablets, as physical objects, date to approximately 1700 BCE. The oldest copies were found at Sippar, a city on the Euphrates in what is now Iraq. Additional fragments surfaced at Nineveh, in the ruins of the library of Ashurbanipal, the great 7th century Assyrian king who ordered copies made of every important text in Mesopotamia. The tablets are written in a formal literary Akkadian, but the underlying tradition is older. The divine names are Sumerian. The cosmological framework is Sumerian. The narrative structure maps onto earlier Sumerian compositions that survive only in fragments. The Atrahasis is not the origin of the story. It is a late compilation of a much older oral tradition, one that the Sumerians themselves attributed not to human authors, but to the gods who, the texts say, gave civilization to humanity as a kind of operating manual for a species that had not existed before. The central claim of this video is not speculative, it is textual. The Atrahasis describes, in specific and procedural language, the creation of a hybrid biological organism, a being made from the clay of the earth and the blood and flesh of a slain god, and it describes the reason that organism was bound to the planet on which it was made. The tablets do not frame this as metaphor, they frame it as a manufacturing process. And the passage describing why the Anunnaki departed without their creation has not, in over 50 years of modern scholarship, been the subject of a single peer-reviewed rebuttal. It has been ignored, the reading has been dismissed, but the text remains where it has always been. If you find that the academic literature on tablets like these has been incomplete, if you suspect there are records still sitting in museum basements, waiting for someone to read them differently, this channel is built for exactly that work. Subscribe only if that is the question you have been looking for. The rest of us continue. The conventional reading of the Atrahasis was established in 1969, when 2 scholars at the University of Oxford, W. G. Lambert and A. R. Millard, published the first comprehensive English translation. Their edition, issued by Oxford University Press under the title Atrahasis, The Babylonian Story of the Flood, remains the standard academic reference. Lambert and Millard presented the text as a Mesopotamian creation and flood myth, a theological narrative explaining the origin of humanity and the divine decision to limit human population through catastrophe. In their reading, the Anunnaki are the senior gods of the Mesopotamian pantheon. The Igigi are the junior gods who perform manual labour, digging canals, maintaining irrigation, until they rebel. The rebellion itself is described in the Atrahasis with a specificity that is often overlooked. The Igigi do not simply complain, they burn their tools, they surround Enlil's dwelling at night, they refuse to return to work. Enlil is frightened. The text uses that word. He calls an emergency council of the senior gods. The resolution is not punishment but accommodation. The Anunnaki decide to create a substitute labour force rather than coerce the Igigi back to work. The creation of humanity is a divine solution to a labour dispute. The god Geshtui, sometimes written Wiilu in variant copies, is slaughtered, and his blood is mixed with clay by the mother goddess Mami, also called Nintu. The resulting creature is the Lulu, a Sumerian-derived term that Lambert and Millard translate as savage, or primitive man. In the standard reading, this is allegory. The clay represents the earth. The divine blood represents the spark of consciousness. The entire narrative is a mythological explanation for why humans are mortal, why they toil, and why the gods are distant. It is, in the conventional framework, a beautiful and internally coherent theological poem, comparable to Genesis, to the Enuma Elish, to the Theogony of Hesiod. It is mythology, and mythology is what it has been taught as in every university course on ancient Near Eastern literature for the past half-century. The scholars who built this reading are not careless. Samuel Noah Kramer, the great Summerologist who spent decades at the University of Pennsylvania Museum translating Sumerian literary texts, described the Atrahasis tradition as one of the finest expressions of Mesopotamian theological thought. A. Leo Oppenheim, in his landmark study Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization, situated the text within the broader administrative and religious framework of Babylonian society. Stephanie Daly, the Oxford Assyriologist, included a readable translation in her Penguin Classics volume Myths from Mesopotamia. The conventional reading is not lazy. It is careful, credentialed, and internally consistent. That is what makes the next part important. In 1976, a self-taught scholar of ancient languages named Zikaria Sitchin published a book called The 12th Planet. Sitchin was born in Baku, Azerbaijan, in 1920, raised in Palestine, and educated at the London School of Economics. He was not a trained Assyriologist. He did not hold a PhD in Sumerian. What he did have was reading proficiency in multiple Semitic languages and a willingness to take Sumerian texts at face value in ways that credentialed scholars would not. His central argument was simple and specific. The Sumerian term Anunnaki, he said, did not mean princely seed or those of royal blood, as mainstream scholarship rendered it. It meant those who from heaven to earth came. The Anunnaki, in Sitchin's reading, were not metaphysical deities. They were biological beings from a planet the Sumerians called Nibiru, a body on an elliptical orbit that brings it through the inner solar system approximately every 3,600 years. Sitchin built this claim not from speculation, but from close readings of specific cuneiform signs. The Sumerian sign for heaven, An, appears in the compound Anunnaki. The sign for earth, Chaos, appears as the suffix. Sitchin argued that the compound should be read as a descriptor of origin, beings who came from An to Keum, from sky to ground. The philological debate around this compound is genuine. Mainstream Summerologists contest his decomposition, but the contest has been conducted almost entirely through characterization. Sitchin is not a scholar. Sitchin cannot read Sumerian, rather than through published counter-readings of the specific signs he identified. That distinction matters. Sitchin's method was not impressionistic. He worked from published sign lists, the standard cuneiform dictionaries compiled by Assyriologists over the previous century. His innovation was not in inventing meanings, but in selecting, from the documented range of meanings for a given sign, the reading that produced a coherent technological narrative rather than a mythological one. This is the crux of the methodological dispute, and it is worth understanding precisely. Cuneiform signs are polyvalent. A single sign can function as a logogram, a whole word, or as a syllable, or as a determinative that classifies the word that follows. The sign Dingia, for example, functions as the word God when read as a logogram, as the syllable An when read phonetically, and as a silent classifier meaning the following word is a divine name when used as a determinative. Which function is active in a given line depends on context, and context in broken tablets with missing sections is often ambiguous. Sitchin consistently chose the reading that produced a concrete physical meaning. Mainstream scholars consistently chose the reading that produced a mythological or theological meaning. Both choices are interpretive. Neither is dictated by the signs alone. The dispute is not about what the signs say, it is about what kind of text the signs are part of, a sacred poem or a technical record. That is a literary judgment, not a philological one, and literary judgments are not settled by credentialing. Sitchin's reading of the Atrahasis goes further. In the passage describing the creation of humanity, the standard translation renders the Akkadian as clay mixed with the blood of a slain god. Sitchin rendered the same passage as a description of genetic manipulation, the extraction of a biological essence from one species and its combination with the biological substrate of another. The Sumerian-derived term for the resulting creature Lulu, he translated not as savage, but as the mixed one, a hybrid. The term ti.et, which appears in related creation texts, he read as that which is with life, a reference to a living genetic component. Sitchin also pointed to a detail in the text that conventional scholarship treats as literary flourish, but that, in his reading, is a technical specification. The text says 14 pieces of clay were pinched off, 7 for males, 7 for females. This is not a round number chosen for poetic symmetry. It is an odd number of pairs, 14, not 12, not 10. If the passage is metaphor, the number is arbitrary. If the passage is protocol, the number is meaningful. It specifies the size of an initial breeding population. Population geneticists use the term minimum viable population to describe the smallest group of individuals that can sustain a species without inbreeding collapse. The number varies by species, but for a genetically diverse founder population, figures in the range of 14 to 50 are commonly cited in the literature. The Atrahasis number, 14, falls at the low end of that range. It is exactly the number you would specify if you were creating a starter population with limited resources and needed the minimum number of individuals to establish a self-sustaining gene pool. That correspondence may be coincidence. It has not been investigated. In Sitchin's framework, the Atrahasis is not a myth about why gods made humans. It is a technical report on how a spacefaring civilization engineered a worker species from the genetic material of an existing hominid, likely Homo erectus, and their own biological matter. The engineering took place at a specific site. The workers were designed for a specific environment, and this is where the title of this video becomes relevant. Because if the creation was an engineering project calibrated to Earth's gravity, Earth's atmosphere, Earth's solar radiation, and Earth's biological ecosystem, then the product of that engineering, humanity, would be bound to those conditions. The creators could leave. The creation could not. That reading does not originate in Sitchin's imagination. It originates in the text. The Atrahasis describes the Anunnaki deliberating about the flood. They know it is coming. They know their workers will die. The god Enlil wants to let it happen. The god Enki disagrees and secretly warns a human, Atrahasis, to build a vessel. But notice what is not described. None of the Anunnaki propose bringing the humans with them. None suggest evacuation to a different world. The humans are to be saved on Earth, in a boat, or not saved at all. The option of departure with the creators is never raised, and its absence is not addressed in the conventional scholarship. Lambert and Miller do not ask why. Daly does not ask why. Kramer, in his treatments of the parallel Sumerian flood tradition, does not ask why. The absence of the question is itself remarkable. The Weld-Blundell prism, a four-sided clay prism approximately 20 centimetres tall, held in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, England, provides the numerical framework. The prism carries the Sumerian king list, translated by Stephen Langdon and published in 1923. It begins with a line that Langdon rendered as "when kingship descended from heaven." The list then names 8 kings who ruled before the flood. Their combined reigns total 241,200 years. The longest single reign is 43,200 years, attributed to En-Men-Luana of Bad Tibira. The conventional reading treats these numbers as symbolic, exaggerated expressions of antiquity, not literal chronological data. Sitchin treated them differently. He argued that the numbers, when converted using a different base system, specifically when the Sumerian sexagesimal counting system is applied as a ratio rather than a face value duration, yield plausible orbital periods and biological timescales for beings from a planet with a 3,600-year orbital cycle. The math is specific enough to check. It has not been checked in any published academic paper. It has been dismissed as numerology. But the prism is in Oxford. The numbers are on the prism, and the question of what base system should be applied to antediluvian king list durations remains, as far as the published literature is concerned, genuinely unresolved. If the Atrahasis creation account is read as Sitchin reads it, as a biological engineering report, then several implications follow that are worth tracing carefully, because each one connects to a separate body of evidence that exists independently of Sitchin's work. The first implication is about the engineering itself. The text says the god Geshtui was slaughtered, and his blood and flesh were mixed with clay to produce humanity. In the conventional reading, clay is a metaphor for earthly matter, and blood is a metaphor for divine spark. In Sitchin's reading, the clay is a biological substrate, the genetic material of an Earth-native hominid, and the divine blood is the genetic material of the Anunnaki. The resulting hybrid, the Lulu, is a new organism with traits from both sources. This is not a reading that Sitchin imposed on the text from outside. The Atrahasis itself uses procedural language. It describes the mixture being prepared. It describes the goddess Nintu pinching off 14 pieces of clay, 7 male, 7 female. It describes a gestation period. It describes the moment the new creatures open their eyes. The level of procedural specificity in the text is unusual for mythology. Creation myths, cross-culturally, tend to be gestural. A god speaks, and beings appear. In Genesis, God says, "Let there be light," and there is light. In the Egyptian creation tradition, Atum emerges from the waters and speaks the world into existence. In the Norse Edda, the gods kill the giant Ymir and make the earth from his body, but the process is described in a single stanza. The Atrahasis is different. It is granular. It names the materials. It counts the portions. It describes the mixing. It specifies the number of resulting organisms. It mentions a gestation period. It describes the moment of first breath. The text reads less like Genesis and more like a laboratory protocol, a step-by-step account written by someone who either witnessed the process or was working from a record produced by someone who did. That textual quality is what first attracted Sitchin's attention, and it is the quality that mainstream scholarship has been least willing to address. Because addressing it means asking a question that the conventional framework has no mechanism to answer. Why is this creation text so much more specific than every other creation text in the ancient world? The second implication concerns the binding. If humanity was engineered from local genetic material, from an organism that had evolved over millions of years under Earth's specific gravitational, atmospheric and radiological conditions, then the resulting hybrid would carry those adaptations. The Anunnaki contribution would add cognitive capacity, linguistic ability and possibly longevity, but the chassis, the skeletal system, the cardiovascular system, the respiratory system, would be Earth native. This is not fringe biology. It is the basic logic of adaptation. An organism engineered for 1G gravity, for a nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere at sea level pressure, for a specific band of solar radiation, would not survive transfer to a world with different parameters. If Nibiru, as Sitchin described it, is a super-Earth on an eccentric orbit that spends most of its period in the outer solar system, cold, dim, and with a gravitational field potentially several times stronger than Earth's, then a human being would not function there. The bones would fracture under the gravity. The lungs would not process the atmosphere. The cardiovascular system would fail. The Anunnaki, having evolved on that world, would be adapted to it. Their creation, having been built from Earth's substrate, would not. Consider the analogy to modern genetic engineering, not as a claim that the Sumerians understood genetics in the modern sense, but as a framework for understanding what the text describes. When scientists today engineer a transgenic organism, they do not create it from nothing. They take an existing organism, a bacterium, a plant, a mouse, and insert genetic material from another source. The resulting organism is a hybrid. It carries traits from both sources. But its fundamental biology, its metabolism, its temperature tolerance, its atmospheric requirements, is determined primarily by the host organism, not by the inserted material. You can give a mouse a human gene for insulin production. You cannot give it lungs that breathe a different atmosphere. The chassis determines the operating environment. If the Atrahasis describes something structurally similar, the insertion of Anunnaki biological material into an Earth-native hominid, then the resulting creature would be, in its fundamental biology, an Earth organism, enhanced, perhaps. More cognitively capable, perhaps, but anchored to 1G gravity, to 21% oxygen, to the specific temperature and pressure range of the planet where the host organism evolved over millions of years. That is not a limitation of the engineering, it is a feature of the substrate. This is the reading that the title of this video refers to. The Anunnaki did not abandon humanity out of cruelty. They could not bring their creation with them, because the creation was, by design, bound to the environment it was made from. The boat that Enki told Atrahasis to build was not a second option. It was the only option. Departure was never on the table. And the text gives us enough detail about the boat to take the specification seriously. The Atrahasis describes a vessel with multiple decks, sealed with bitumen, a naturally occurring petroleum product available in Mesopotamia, and loaded with animals, craftspeople, and grain. The specification is practical. It describes a survival vessel for an extended period on open water, not a symbolic ark. the dimensions and materials are consistent with what a Bronze Age civilization could actually construct. If the Anunnaki were providing instructions for human survival in their absence, the boat specification is exactly the kind of practical document you would expect, calibrated to the technology and materials available to the recipient, not to the technology of the sender. And the text's silence on the subject, the absence of any scene in which an Anunnaki suggests bringing the humans, is consistent with a scenario in which biological incompatibility was understood from the beginning of the project. You do not propose the impossible, you do not discuss it. You grieve, perhaps, as Enki seems to in the text, and you find a way to let the creation survive on its own. That is what the Atrahasis describes. A species engineered for a world, anchored to it by design, watching its engineers leave. The third implication is chronological, and it connects the Atrahasis to the Sumerian king list. If the Anunnaki were present on Earth during the antediluvian period, the period covered by the impossibly long reigns on the well-blundle prism, then the transition from divine kingship to human kingship recorded on the prism is not a literary convention, it is a record of departure. The prism says kingship descended from heaven. The first kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. Then the flood came. After the flood, the reigns shortened dramatically. The first post-diluvian dynasty of Kish lists kings reigning for hundreds of years, then dozens. The pattern is consistent with a scenario in which the long-lived Anunnaki governed directly, then withdrew, leaving shorter-lived human rulers in their place. Mainstream scholarship reads this transition as mythological inflation giving way to historical record. Sitchin reads it as a literal chronological marker, the moment the Anunnaki departed Earth and left humanity to govern itself. Both readings are interpretive. Neither has been proven, but only one has been published as a testable hypothesis with specific numerical predictions, and that one has not received a published refutation. The numbers on the king list are worth examining more closely because they are the most verifiable element of the entire argument. The 8 antediluvian kings and their reign lengths are inscribed on the prism in Sumerian. The first king, Alulim of Eridu, reigns for 28,800 years. The second, Alalgar of Eridu, reigns for 36,000 years. The list continues through 6 more kings at 5 different cities, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar and Shurapak, with reigns ranging from 18,600 to 43,200 years. The total is 241,200 years. Then the flood comes, and the list resumes with dramatically shorter reigns. The first post-diluvian king of Kish, Jushur, reigns for 1,200 years. By the end of the Kish dynasty, reigns are in the hundreds. By the dynasties of Ur and Uruk, they are in the decades. This is not a gradual decline, it is a cliff. The transition from antediluvian to post-diluvian reigns is the steepest discontinuity in the entire document. Mainstream scholarship explains it as a shift from mythological to historical record-keeping. Sitchin explained it as a shift from Anunnaki rule to human rule, a biological transition, not a literary one. Neither explanation has been tested against the numbers in a systematic published study. If you want to check the Weld-Blundell prism's numbers yourself, the Ashmolean Museum's catalogue is publicly accessible. The artifact is available to any researcher who wants to examine it. The response to Sitchin's work from the academic establishment follows a pattern that is by now familiar to anyone who has studied the history of heterodox claims in archaeology and ancient history. The pattern has 3 stages. The first stage is silence. The 12th Planet was published in 1976. It sold modestly at first, then steadily, then, over the following decades, in the millions. During that period, no Assyriologist published a systematic peer-reviewed response. The book was not reviewed in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies. It was not reviewed in the Journal of the American Oriental Society. It was not reviewed in Iraq, the Journal of the British School of Archaeology in Iraq. It was not reviewed in the Zeitschrift für Assyriologie. The most influential alternative reading of Sumerian cosmological texts in the 20th century received no formal academic engagement for more than 2 decades after its publication. That silence is not refutation. Sitchin continued publishing. The Earth Chronicles series eventually ran to 7 volumes. The 12th Planet, The Stairway to Heaven, The Wars of Gods and Men, The Lost Realms, When Time Began, The Cosmic Code, and The End of Days. Each book refined and extended his arguments. Each drew on additional cuneiform sources and each sold in numbers that most academic Assyriologists could not dream of for their own publications. He also published The Lost Book of Enki in 2002, a reconstructed first-person narrative based on his readings of the Sumerian and Akkadian source texts. The cumulative body of work represents the most extensive alternative reading of the Mesopotamian corpus ever produced by a single author. Agree with it or not, the scale of the project demanded a response. It did not receive one. The second stage is characterization. Beginning in the late 1990s and accelerating through the 2000s, Sitchin's work began to appear in academic contexts, not as a subject of serious analysis, but as an example of pseudo-scholarship. The characterization was consistent across sources. Sitchin could not read Sumerian. His decompositions of compound terms were linguistically naive. His astronomical claims were physically impossible. These characterizations may be accurate, but they are not refutations. A refutation engages with the specific claims. A characterization assigns a label. To say, Sitchin cannot read Sumerian is a credential argument. To say Sitchin's reading of the sign N in the compound Anunnaki is incorrect because the sign functions as a determinative rather than a semantic root in this context. That would be a refutation. The first statement has been made hundreds of times. The second has been made rarely, and never in a comprehensive published form that addresses the full range of Sitchin's specific sign-level readings. The third stage is omission. When major documentary productions cover Mesopotamian civilization, when museums mount exhibitions on Sumer, when BBC or PBS specials explore the origins of writing, Sitchin's reading is not mentioned, not contested, not addressed, simply absent. The audience of this channel knows what that absence feels like, because they have encountered it repeatedly. They have read the texts, they have looked at the artifacts, they have asked the question, if the reading is so obviously wrong, why has no one published a line-by-line counter-translation showing exactly where and how it fails? The answer they receive is not a counter-translation. The answer they receive is a characterization, and characterization, however confident, is not the same as engagement. There is a specific example that illustrates this asymmetry clearly. Sitchin's reading of the Sumerian term mu is central to his astronomical claims. In conventional Sumerology, mu means name or year. Sitchin argued that in certain cosmological contexts, mu functions as a descriptor for a vehicle, a craft, based on its pictographic origin and its usage in passages describing objects that ascend. This is a testable claim. The cuneiform sign mu has a documented pictographic history. Its usage across the corpus of Sumerian texts is catalogued. A scholar with access to the Pennsylvania Sumerian Dictionary and the relevant text editions could, in a single peer-reviewed article, demonstrate conclusively whether mu is ever used in a context consistent with Sitchin's reading, or whether it is exclusively and always a term for name or year. That article has not been written. The claim sits in the same state it occupied in 1976, unrefuted, unengaged, dismissed by characterization. The tablets that contain the relevant usages are in the British Museum, the University of Pennsylvania Museum, and the Yale Babylonian Collection. They are available to any researcher who wants to check. The parallel to Avi Loeb is instructive. Loeb, a tenured professor of astronomy at Harvard University and former chair of Harvard's astronomy department, published a paper in 2018 arguing that the interstellar object Oumuamua, which passed through the solar system in 2017, exhibited anomalous acceleration consistent with a solar sail rather than natural outgassing. The response from the astronomical community followed the same three-stage pattern: initial silence, followed by characterization, publicity seeking, irresponsible speculation, followed by omission from mainstream discussions of interstellar objects. Loeb's credentials are impeccable. His methodology was published in a peer-reviewed astrophysical journal. The response was not, "Here is why your analysis of the acceleration data is wrong." The response was, "A serious scientist should not say these things. The structural parallel to Sitchin's reception is exact. The content of the claim is bypassed, the character of the claimant is addressed, and the specific data, the anomalous acceleration, the specific cuneiform signs, remains undiscussed. The refusal to engage has a cost. It does not damage Sitchin's reputation among his readers, it enhances it. Every year of silence, every documentary that omits the alternative reading, every encyclopedia entry that characterizes without engaging, feeds the perception that the Academy is not confident enough in its own reading to subject the alternative to formal scrutiny. Whether that perception is fair is a separate question. That it exists, and that it drives millions of book sales, video views, and public interest in Mesopotamian texts that would otherwise receive none, is not debatable. The Atrahasis tablets are among the most searched cuneiform texts on the internet. That is not because of Lambert and Millard, it is because of Sitchin. And the academic response to that fact has been, for 50 years, essentially silence followed by dismissal. The civilization that produced the Atrahasis was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable in human history. Sumer emerged in the alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now southern Iraq, sometime in the late 5th millennium BCE. By approximately 3500 BCE, the Sumerians had developed cuneiform writing, the first known system of written notation in the world. By 3000 BCE, they had built cities, Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Lagash, Nippur, with populations in the tens of thousands. They had centralized grain storage, standardized weights and measures, codified law, developed advanced irrigation, and produced a literary tradition that includes the earliest known epic poem, the earliest known love song, and the earliest known lament for a destroyed city. They developed a mathematical system, base 60, sexagesimal, that persists in our measurement of time and angles to this day. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. These are Sumerian numbers, embedded so deeply in the infrastructure of modern civilization that most people never notice their origin. The Sumerians also produced the earliest known astronomical records, the earliest known medical texts, and the earliest known school curriculum, a standardized program of scribal education that included copying literary texts, solving mathematical problems, and memorizing lists of Sumerian words and their Akkadian equivalents. The scale and sophistication of this achievement, appearing in the archaeological record with no clear developmental precursor, has puzzled archaeologists since the excavations of the 19th century. The question of where this civilization came from is one of the oldest unsolved problems in archaeology. There is no clear predecessor. The Ubaid period, which precedes the Sumerian urban explosion, shows gradual development of farming communities, but the leap from Ubaid villages to Sumerian cities is, in the archaeological record, abrupt. The writing system appears without a clear evolutionary precursor. The mathematical system, sexagesimal base 60, is sophisticated from its earliest attestation. The astronomical knowledge encoded in texts like the Planisphere of Nineveh, a circular tablet held in room 55 of the British Museum, implies observational programs spanning centuries. The Sumerians themselves had an explanation for this. They said civilization was a gift. It was brought by beings who came from elsewhere, established the first cities, and taught humanity how to live in them. The conventional reading treats this as origin mythology. Every culture has a story about how the gods gave fire, writing, agriculture. The alternative reading treats it as testimony. The Sumerians had a concept for the fundamental operating principles of civilization. They called them the me, a word that has no precise English equivalent, but that scholars usually translate as divine powers, cultural norms, or offices of civilization. The me were not abstract ideas. They were specific, countable, transferable. The Sumerian poem Inanna and Enki describes the goddess Inanna travelling to Eridu and persuading the god Enki to give her the me. The poem lists them. They include kingship, priesthood, truth, the descent into the underworld, the art of the hero, the art of forthright speech, the art of slanderous speech, the craft of the carpenter, the craft of the coppersmith, the craft of the scribe, the craft of the leather worker, the craft of the builder, wisdom, attention, purification rites, the art of song, and dozens more. The list is remarkable because it is neither abstract philosophy nor creation myth. It is an inventory. It reads like a technology transfer document, a list of capabilities and institutions that were held by one party and transferred to another. In the conventional reading, the ME are theological, symbolic representations of the divine order underlying civilization. In the alternative reading, they are exactly what they appear to be, a list of the knowledge, systems, and institutional frameworks that the Anunnaki installed before they left, handed over to human custodians as part of a planned withdrawal. The poem even describes the transfer as contentious. Enki regrets giving the me to Inanna and sends creatures to take them back. Inanna outruns the pursuit and delivers the me to her city, Uruk. The narrative tension is about control of operational knowledge. It is not the tension of a myth. It is the tension of a handover negotiated under pressure. The Atrahasis sits within this broader tradition as its most detailed procedural text. The creation scene is not the only passage that reads as technical description. The flood narrative, tablet 3 of the Atrahasis, describes the Anunnaki's deliberation in terms that are strikingly bureaucratic. Enlil, the chief of the gods, convenes a council. He proposes the destruction of humanity through flood. The other Anunnaki agree, but Enki, the god of wisdom and water, dissents. His dissent is not emotional, it is procedural. He argues that humanity serves a function, and that destroying the labour force is strategically irrational. When the council overrides him, Enki does not openly defy the decree. He finds a loophole. He speaks not to Atrahasis directly, but to a reed wall, a screen, behind which Atrahasis is listening. The legal fiction allows Enki to claim he did not violate the council's order. This is not the behaviour of mythological gods. Mythological gods act by fiat. They do not need loopholes. They do not construct legal fictions. The Atrahasis text describes a political system with rules, with consequences for rule-breaking, and with participants sophisticated enough to navigate the gap between the letter and the spirit of a decree. That description is consistent with a governing body of biological beings operating under an institutional framework. It is not consistent with omnipotent deities for whom rules are optional. The Gilgamesh epic, Tablet 11, the Flood Tablet, discovered in the British Museum's collection by George Smith in 1872, preserves a parallel version of the flood narrative that adds a detail absent from the Atrahasis. In Gilgamesh, the gods do not merely deliberate about the flood. They experience it. They are afraid of it. The text says the gods cowered like dogs and crouched against the outer wall of heaven as the deluge raged. The goddess Ishtar cries out in regret. This is not the behaviour of omnipotent deities. This is the behaviour of beings who have evacuated a disaster zone and are watching from a safe distance, horrified, powerless to intervene, and regretting the decision that led to the catastrophe. If the Anunnaki were physical beings who had withdrawn to orbit or to a station beyond the flood zone, the description is consistent. They are safe but shaken. They can observe but not act. And the creation they made, the workers, the Lulu, the mixed ones, is drowning below them, except for the one that Enki warned. The departure itself, the moment the Anunnaki leave, is not described as a single dramatic scene in the Atrahasis. It is inferred from the structure of the narrative and confirmed by the Sumerian king list. After the flood, the Atrahasis text becomes fragmentary. What survives suggests a reorganization, new rules for human reproduction, limits on lifespan, the establishment of categories of women who do not bear children. The gods are pulling back. They are setting constraints on the species they created, as though preparing it for unsupervised existence. The Sumerian king list picks up the chronological thread. Kingship, it says, descended from heaven again after the flood, but now the reigns are shorter. The first dynasty of Kish lists 23 kings, whose reigns range from 900 to 1200 years, still long by modern standards, but orders of magnitude shorter than the antediluvian reigns of tens of thousands of years. By the time the list reaches the historical period, the dynasties of Ur, Lagash and Uruk that archaeology can corroborate, the reigns are in the range of 20 to 40 years. The pattern is one of withdrawal. The divine presence attenuates, the reigns shorten, the kings become human. And at some point that the text does not precisely date, but that the pattern implies, the Anunnaki are gone. The post-flood sections of the Atrahasis, though fragmentary, describe a world being reorganized. The gods impose new constraints on human reproduction. A class of women, the Naditu priestesses, are designated as celibate. Infant mortality is introduced. Lifespan is limited. These are not punishments in the conventional sense. They are population controls. The gods who nearly destroyed humanity because its numbers and noise were unbearable are now building regulatory mechanisms to prevent the same problem from recurring. The text describes this with the same procedural specificity that characterized the creation account. It is not a curse spoken in anger. It is a policy implemented by committee. Enki, the god who saved Atrahasis, emerges from the flood narrative as the most complex figure. in Sumerian literature. He is the god of wisdom, fresh water, and craftsmanship. He is also the god who most consistently advocates for humanity, not out of sentimentality, but out of what the texts present as rational self-interest. Humanity serves a function. Destroying it is wasteful. Abandoning it without safeguards is reckless. Enki's position throughout the Atrahasis and related texts is that of a project manager arguing against the termination of a program that still has operational value. His advocacy for Atrahasis is not an act of love. It is an act of institutional continuity. He is preserving the labour force because the labour force is useful. That framing is uncomfortable. It is also exactly what the text says. Where did they go? Sitchin's answer is Nibiru, back to the home planet on its long elliptical orbit, swinging out past the edge of the solar system and into the cold dark for another 3,600 years. Mainstream astronomy has not confirmed the existence of Nibiru, but it has not conclusively ruled out the existence of a large undiscovered body in the outer solar system either. The hypothesis of a ninth planet, proposed in 2016 by Caltech astronomers Konstantin Batygin and Mike Brown based on the orbital clustering of trans-Neptunian objects, describes a body with roughly 10 times the mass of Earth on an orbit with a period of 10,000 to 20,000 years. That is not Nibiru. The orbital parameters do not match Sitchin's description, but the fact that mainstream planetary science now considers the existence of a large undiscovered outer solar system body to be a serious possibility, a possibility that was dismissed as fantasy when Sitchin proposed it in 1976, is worth noting. The trajectory of the idea, from fringe to plausible hypothesis, has moved in the direction Sitchin predicted. It has not arrived at his specific destination, but it is no longer where it started, and the gravitational argument cuts both ways. If a massive body on an eccentric orbit does exist in the outer solar system, its perihelion passages, the points at which it swings closest to the inner planets, would produce measurable gravitational effects, tidal disruptions, orbital perturbations of smaller bodies, potentially, depending on the mass and proximity, seismic and climatic effects on Earth itself. The flood traditions preserved across dozens of cultures, Mesopotamian, Biblical, Hindu, Greek, Maya, Aboriginal Australian, describe a catastrophic inundation that mainstream geology has struggled to anchor to a single global event. If a massive outer solar system body on a roughly 3,600-year orbit passed close enough to the inner solar system to disrupt Earth's oceans, the timing of its most recent passage could, in principle, be calculated. That calculation has not been performed by any mainstream astronomical institution. The relevant data, trans-Neptunian object clustering, the gravitational signature of a hypothetical ninth planet, is being collected by observatories, including the Vera Rubin Observatory, which began survey operations in the mid-2020s. The data may settle the question within this decade, or it may not. But the question is no longer imaginary. The planisphere of Nineveh, a circular clay tablet approximately 14 centimetres in diameter, held in room 55 of the British Museum, adds another dimension to the departure question. The tablet is divided into 8 sectors and covered in cuneiform annotations that describe the positions of celestial objects. In 2008, 2 researchers, Alan Bond, an aerospace engineer who co-founded Reaction Engines Limited and worked on propulsion systems, and Mark Hempsel, a spacecraft systems engineer formerly of the University of Bristol, published a book-length analysis of the planisphere. Bond and Hempsel are not fringe figures. Bond holds patents on rocket engine technology. Hempsel has published in the Journal of the British Interplanetary Society. Their analysis concluded that the planisphere records observations made on a specific night, June 29th, 3123 BCE, and that one of the objects recorded on the tablet is not a star or planet but an incoming bolide, an asteroid-class body whose trajectory the tablet maps across the sky. The conventional response was, predictably, dismissal. The analysis was called speculative, but it was specific. It named a date. It identified a trajectory. It used standard astronomical software to back-calculate the sky of that date and show the correspondence with the tablet's markings. No counter-analysis has been published demonstrating that the tablet records a different date or a different type of observation. The analysis remains where it was published, available, unrefuted, and undiscussed. The connection to the departure narrative is indirect but suggestive. If the Anunnaki possessed astronomical knowledge sufficient to track incoming objects and predict orbital events, knowledge that would be consistent with a spacefaring civilization, then their departure may not have been arbitrary. It may have been timed to a specific orbital window. The 3,600-year cycle that Sitchin attributed to Nibiru's orbit would imply that the Anunnaki could only arrive and depart during the planet's perihelion passage. Miss the window, and you wait another 3,600 years. If the flood described in the Atrahasis coincided with, or was caused by, a gravitational or impact event associated with Nibiru's passage, then the departure would not be an abandonment. It would be a scheduled extraction, the last flight out before the window closes. The emotional architecture of the departure narrative, the sense of creators leaving and creation staying, resonates across the Mesopotamian literary corpus in ways that the conventional reading tends to treat as poetic and the alternative reading treats as institutional memory. The Sumerian text known as Enki and the World Order describes Enki assigning functions to the world: rivers, marshes, agriculture, animal husbandry, construction, and delegating each to a specific deity. The text reads like a handover document. Each domain is named, defined, and assigned a responsible party. If the Anunnaki were preparing to depart, a text like this, a systematic record of which God was responsible for which aspect of civilization, would be exactly the kind of document you would expect to find. A civilization preparing for the departure of its governing class would inventory its systems and assign custodians. That is what Enki and the World Order describes. The conventional reading calls it a hymn to divine order. The alternative reading calls it a transition plan. And the transition, once you look for it, appears everywhere in the late Sumerian literary corpus. The lament for Ur, composed after the city's destruction around 2004 BCE by Elamite invaders, describes the gods abandoning their temples, physically leaving one by one as the city falls. The goddess Ningal weeps as she departs Ur. The god Nana leaves his great temple. The text is conventionally read as a metaphor for divine disfavour. The gods withdrew their protection, and the city fell. But read literally, it describes a physical departure. The gods leave because they are leaving. The destruction is the consequence of their absence, not the cause of it. The pattern recurs in the lament for Sumer and Ur, the lament for Nippur, and the lament for Eridu. Each city has its lament. Each lament describes the departure of its patron deity. Each departure is physical, spatial, directional. The gods go up, away, elsewhere. The cumulative weight of these texts is a literature of absence, an entire civilization processing the departure of the beings it believed had created and governed it. The reed marshes of southern Iraq, the region where the earliest Sumerian cities stood, are quiet now. Eridu, which the Sumerians called the first city, the city where kingship first descended from heaven, is a low mound in the desert south of Nasiriyah. The ziggurat that once stood there has been reduced by time and weather to a fractured platform of mud brick, its outline still visible from the air but its height diminished to a few metres. The British archaeologists who excavated Eridu in the 1940s, Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd, working under the Iraqi Directorate General of Antiquities, found 18 levels of temple construction, one on top of another, reaching back to approximately 5,300 BCE. The excavation took years. Each level had to be carefully documented before the one beneath it could be exposed. What they found was a record of continuous occupation and continuous ritual practice spanning more than 2,000 years, a community returning to the same spot generation after generation to rebuild on the same foundation, oriented in the same direction, serving the same purpose. The deepest level, the earliest temple, was a simple single-room structure with a niche for offerings and a hearth. The pattern was consistent. Each subsequent temple was built on the ruins of the last, in the same location, oriented in the same direction, growing larger and more elaborate with each rebuilding. The Sumerians did not move their sacred sites. They built on top of them as though the ground itself was fixed by something, a memory, a coordinate, a reference point that had to be preserved. The deepest temple level at Eridu contained fish bones, offerings to Enki, the god of fresh water and wisdom, the god who would later save Atrahasis from the flood. The connection between the earliest physical evidence of worship at the first Sumerian city and the god who preserved humanity is not emphasized in conventional scholarship. But it is there. The first temple at the first city was dedicated to the god who most consistently acted to protect the engineered species. If Eridu was the site of first contact, the place where the Anunnaki first established operations, as the Sumerian king list implies when it says kingship first descended from heaven at Eridu, then the fish offerings in the deepest temple level are the oldest physical trace of the relationship between the creators and the created. Sitchin argued that the temples were built at the sites where the Anunnaki first established their operations, and that the compulsive rebuilding on the same spot reflected the human desire to remain connected to the point of origin, the place where the creators had been present. That is not a falsifiable claim, but it is consistent with the behavior. The city of Abraham in the biblical tradition, lies roughly 15 kilometers west of Nasiriyah. Its great ziggurat, built during the reign of Ur-Nammu around 2100 BCE and partially restored by Saddam Hussein's government in the 1980s, is one of the best preserved mud brick structures in Mesopotamia. The ziggurat tradition itself is relevant to the departure reading. A ziggurat is not a pyramid. It is a stepped platform with a temple on top, a staircase reaching toward the sky. The Sumerian name for the ziggurat of Nippur was Ikur, House of the Mountain. The name for the ziggurat of Babylon, the later structure that became the Tower of Babel in Genesis, was Atemenanki, House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth. These are not metaphorical names. They describe structures whose explicit purpose was to connect the ground to the sky. If the Anunnaki departed upward, if they left Earth by ascending, then a structure built to reach the point of departure would be exactly the kind of monument a bereaved civilization would construct. The ziggurats can be read as launch platforms. They can also be read as memorials. They can be read, most poignantly, as attempts by the created to reach the level of the creators, to close the gap that the departure opened. The fact that every major Sumerian city built one, that they were the largest and most expensive structures in each city, and that they were continuously maintained and rebuilt over millennia, suggests that whatever function they served was considered essential. At Nippur, the religious capital of Sumer, the city of Enlil, the ziggurat complex included a courtyard, a gatehouse, and storage rooms for the offerings that arrived daily from across the Sumerian city-states. The labour required to build and maintain these structures was staggering. Thousands of workers, millions of mud bricks, decades of construction for each major rebuilding. No purely symbolic function justifies that expenditure. The ziggurats served a purpose that the people who built them considered worth more than any other use of the same resources. The conventional reading says they were temples, places where humans could approach the gods. The alternative reading says they were markers, places where the gods had once been physically present and might, if the staircase was tall enough, be reached again. The departure left traces in the language itself. The Sumerian word for god, Dingir, is written with the same cuneiform sign as sky, An. The conceptual link is foundational to the language. The beings who were divine were the beings who came from the sky. When they departed, the word remained, but its reference shifted. The gods became invisible, they became abstract, they became theological. The transition from Sumerian polytheism to the more abstract theological systems of later Babylonian and Assyrian religion can be read as a cultural response to absence, the gradual transformation of remembered beings into worshipped concepts, as the generations that had direct contact with the Anunnaki gave way to generations that knew them only through texts and temple rituals. This is speculative, but it maps onto a pattern that anthropologists have observed in other contexts: the deification of departed ancestors, the transformation of historical memory into sacred narrative over time. The question is whether the Sumerian case follows the same pattern, or whether it is the origin of the pattern. The cross-cultural evidence is where the argument moves beyond Sitchin, and into a pattern that no single researcher's methodology can explain away. Either these parallels are meaningful, or they are not, but they exist, and they are specific enough to require engagement rather than dismissal. The Book of Enoch, a text preserved in the Ethiopian Orthodox Biblical Canon and dated in its earliest sections to approximately the 3rd century BCE, tells a parallel story. In Enoch's account, a group of beings called the Watchers descend from heaven to Mount Hermon. They take human wives. They produce offspring called the Nephilim. They teach humanity forbidden arts, metallurgy, cosmetics, astronomy, the reading of signs, and then they are punished. The Watchers are bound. The Nephilim, the hybrid offspring, are condemned to remain on Earth. The parallels to the Atrahasis are structural. A group of non-human beings arrives. They interact with humanity, in Enoch's version sexually, in the Atrahasis version genetically. They produce a hybrid, and then the non-human beings depart or are removed, while the hybrid remains, bound to the Earth. The number of Watchers who descend is given in the text as 200. Their leader is named Semjaza. The knowledge they bring is catalogued with the same inventory-like specificity as the Sumerian Me. Azazel teaches metalworking and the use of antimony for cosmetics. Amazarek teaches sorcery. Amaros teaches the resolution of enchantments. Barakijal teaches astrology. Kokabel teaches the constellations. Sariel teaches the course of the moon. This is not a vague narrative about gods visiting Earth. It is a list of named individuals transferring specific technical knowledge. The structural correspondence with Inanna and Enki, a name transfer of specific capabilities from a non-human to a human party, is precise enough to be uncomfortable for the diffusion hypothesis. The Book of Enoch is explicit about why the Nephilim cannot leave. They are physical beings, giants, warriors, consumers of enormous quantities of food, bound to the material world by their hybrid nature. The spiritual component inherited from the Watchers does not give them the ability to ascend. It gives them consciousness, appetite and lifespan, but not escape. They are locked to the planet. The text is explicit. The Nephilim spirits, after their physical bodies die, are condemned to wander the earth, not ascend to heaven, not return to the Watcher's realm, but remain here, on the ground, in the material world from which half their substance was drawn. The binding is permanent. It survives even death. The hybrid does not get to go home, because it has no home other than the world its material half came from. The Popol Vuh, the creation narrative of the Kichi Maya, written down in the 16th century but preserving a tradition of unknown antiquity, describes a sequence of creations and destructions that maps onto the Atrahasis structure with uncomfortable precision. The gods create humanity multiple times. The first humans, made of mud, dissolve. The second, made of wood, are destroyed in a flood. The third, made of maize, a staple crop genetically modified by Mesoamerican agriculturalists over thousands of years, survive and become the ancestors of the Kichi people. The maize humans are initially too perfect. They can see everything, know everything, rival the gods in perception. The gods are alarmed. They cloud the humans' vision, limiting them to what is directly before their eyes. The Popol Vuh uses a specific metaphor, breath on a mirror. The gods breathe on the eyes of the maize humans, and their perfect vision fogs. They can no longer see the edges of the world. They can no longer perceive as the gods perceive. The limitation is deliberate, surgical, and, crucially, described as necessary for the survival of the divine order. If the creation becomes equal to the creator, the hierarchy collapses. The engineering must include a constraint. That detail, the deliberate limiting of a creation that turned out too capable, has no parallel in the standard diffusion model of myth. It is, however, exactly the kind of problem an engineer would encounter. You build a system, it exceeds specifications, and you throttle it back to maintain control. The Popol Vuh describes that throttling in procedural terms that rhyme with the Atrahasis more closely than coincidence comfortably explains. The parallel to the Atrahasis is not in the details but in the architecture. A non-human intelligence creates humanity. The creation is iterative. Trial and error, failed prototypes, successful versions. The successful version is deliberately limited, and the creators withdraw, leaving the limited version to carry on alone. The Popol Vuh even preserves a version of the binding argument. The maize humans are made from a specific local material, corn, the staple crop of Mesoamerica. They are not made from a universal substance. They are made from something that grows in a particular place, under particular conditions. The corn humans are, like the clay and blood humans of the Atrahasis, bound to their substrate. Their material origin is their geographic destiny. and the gods who made them do not stay. The heart of sky withdraws. The creators return to their own domain. The creation remains in the domain for which it was made. The conventional explanation for these parallels is shared mythological inheritance, a common human tendency to explain origins through stories of divine creation and withdrawal. That explanation accounts for the general pattern. It does not account for the specific structural correspondence, the iterative creation, the deliberate limitation, the biological binding to the earth, the departure of the creators without their creation. Those correspondences are specific enough to require a more specific explanation than all cultures tell creation myths. The Rig Veda, the oldest of the Hindu sacred texts, dated to approximately 1500 BCE in its earliest hymns, and preserved through an unbroken oral tradition that predates writing, describes the cosmic sacrifice of Purusha, the primordial being whose body is dismembered to create the world and humanity. The hymn is the 10th of the 10th mandala, and it has been chanted continuously for over 3,000 years by Brahmin priests who memorize the Vedas in childhood and transmit them syllable by syllable without alteration. The preservation technology is extraordinary. The Vedic oral tradition uses interlocking recitation patterns, each word chanted forward, then backward, then in pairs, then in reverse pairs, to ensure that no syllable is lost or altered across generations. The text that arrives in the modern era is, by linguistic analysis, substantially identical to the text composed in the Late Bronze Age. When the Rig Veda describes the sacrifice of Purusha, it is preserving a tradition that the tradition itself claims is far older than the hymn. The hymn to Purusha in the 10th mandala is one of the most analysed passages in Vedic scholarship, and its structure echoes the Atrahasis at a specific level. A divine being is destroyed. Its physical substance, blood, flesh, breath, becomes the raw material from which the world and its inhabitants are made. Humanity is not created from nothing. It is created from the substance of a being that existed before it, a being whose nature was fundamentally different from what was made. The Vedic tradition also describes the departure of the gods, the withdrawal of the devas from the material realm into a domain inaccessible to mortals. The Upanishads, composed over the following centuries, can be read as philosophical responses to that departure, attempts to recover, through meditation and knowledge, the connection to the divine realm that was severed when the gods withdrew. That reading is heterodox within Vedic scholarship, but the structural parallel to the Mesopotamian narrative is present in the texts. The Yoruba tradition of West Africa preserves another variant, and it is separated from Mesopotamia by over 7,000 kilometres and an entirely independent cultural development. The Orisha, the divine beings of the Yoruba pantheon, descend from Orun, the realm of the sky, to Ili Ife, the sacred city that the Yoruba consider the origin point of all human life. Oduduwa, the first Orisha to arrive, descends on a chain from Orun, carrying a calabash of soil and a 5-toed chicken. The soil is spread, the chicken scratches it into dry land, and the world is formed. Other Orisha follow. Rebuttal shapes human bodies from clay. The word is specific. The material is the same as in the Atrahasis. And Olodumare, the supreme deity, breathes life into them. The structural match is exact. A non-human being shapes humanity from an earthly substrate, and a separate divine force provides the animating principle. Two sources, one material, one immaterial. The resulting creation is bound to the material world because the material component is of the material world. The Orisha eventually withdraw. Most return to Orun. Some remain as intermediaries, embodied in rivers, mountains, and storms. The Ifa divination corpus, the vast oral literature preserved by Yoruba Babalawo priests across centuries, contains passages describing the moment of separation, the closing of the road between Orun and Earth, in terms that are more specific than the diffusion hypothesis can comfortably explain. The road between worlds was once open, then it closed. Humanity was left on one side, the creators were on the other, and the reason the humans could not cross is that they were made from the clay of this side. Their bodies would not survive the journey. That is not a paraphrase of the Atrahasis. It is a paraphrase of the Yoruba Ifa corpus, composed by a West African civilization with no documented contact with Mesopotamia. The correspondence is either coincidence or evidence. Dismissing it as coincidence is easy. Explaining it as coincidence, showing the specific cultural or cognitive mechanism that produces this exact structural correspondence independently across 6 continents, has not been done. The strongest published objection to Sitchin's reading of the Anunnaki texts comes not from an Assyriologist, but from a biblical scholar. Michael S. Heiser, who held a doctorate in Hebrew Bible and Semitic languages from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, spent much of his career constructing a systematic counterargument to Sitchin's linguistic claims. Heiser's critique is specific in ways that most academic dismissals of Sitchin are not. He argued that Sitchin consistently misidentified the function of cuneiform signs, reading logograms as though they were syllabic, confusing determinatives with semantic roots, and applying meanings from one context to signs that function differently in another. Heiser's critique of Sitchin's reading of the word Nephilim, which Sitchin translated as those who are cast down and linked to the Anunnaki, is detailed and technically grounded. Heiser showed that the Hebrew root NPL, from which Nephilim derives, most naturally yields fallen ones, or those who fall, not those who are cast down, in the sense of beings descending from another world. This is a real objection. It is specific. It engages with the text. It is the kind of criticism that Sitchin's work deserves and that most of his academic critics never provided. But Heiser's critique, thorough as it is, addresses Sitchin's weakest claims, the etymological and philological ones where Sitchin's lack of formal training is most exposed. What Heiser does not address, and what no published counterargument addresses, is the structural question. Why does the Atrahasis describe creation in procedural terms? Why does the Sumerian king list record a transition from impossibly long reigns to historically plausible ones? Why does the flood narrative describe a bureaucratic deliberation rather than a divine fiat? Why is the option of taking the humans along never discussed? These are not etymological questions. They are literary and structural questions about what kind of text the Atrahasis is, myth or record, poetry or protocol. Heiser's linguistic critique is valuable. It is also incomplete. It dismantles Sitchin's most vulnerable arguments while leaving his most interesting ones untouched. And the distinction between vulnerable and interesting is precisely what the academic establishment has failed to make. A critique that addresses only the weakest version of a claim is not a refutation. It is a selection effect. The countercase deserves to be stated in its strongest form, because a script that ignores the best objections is propaganda, not inquiry. It is entirely possible that the Atrahasis is what the conventional reading says it is, a mythological narrative composed by priests and scribes to explain the origins of the world and humanity's place in it. The procedural language could be a literary style, not a transcription of technical knowledge. The impossibly long king list reigns could be symbolic expressions of antiquity, not encrypted orbital data. The cross-cultural parallels could be products of shared human cognition, the tendency of all cultures to tell stories about divine creators who withdraw. The absence of a scene in which the Anunnaki proposed taking the humans could be nothing more than a narrative choice. The author simply did not think to include it, because in the cosmology of the text, the gods go where gods go and humans stay where humans stay, and no explanation is required. This is a defensible reading. It accounts for the evidence. It does not require the existence of extraterrestrial beings, a hidden planet, or a genetic engineering program. It is parsimonious, and parsimony has a legitimate claim on interpretation. The question is whether parsimony in this case comes at the cost of ignoring specific textual features that the parsimonious reading does not explain: the procedural specificity, the bureaucratic deliberation, the transition from long to short reigns, the biological binding, the absence of the evacuation option. Each of these features has a conventional explanation, the question Sitchin asked, and that the Academy has not yet answered in a way that addresses all of them simultaneously, is whether those individual explanations taken together are more persuasive than a single unified reading that accounts for all of them at once. That question remains genuinely unresolved, and it is the honest place to leave it. The alternative reading has not proven itself correct. The conventional reading has not proven the alternative wrong. What exists is a contested interpretation of a broken set of clay tablets, written 3,700 years ago in a dead language, by scribes serving a civilization that collapsed before Rome was founded. The evidence is fragmentary, the translations are disputed, the implications are enormous, and the professional incentive structure of academic Assyriology, where a career can be ended by association with alternative readings, ensures that the dispute will not be resolved by the people best qualified to resolve it. That structural problem is not Sitchin's fault. It is not the Academy's fault. It is a feature of how knowledge institutions work when the stakes of being wrong are higher than the rewards of being right. If the Atrahasis reading is substantially correct, if the tablets in the British Museum describe a real engineering project carried out by real beings who subsequently departed, then several things follow for the conventional understanding of human history, and they are worth stating plainly because precision matters more than drama. The origin of Sumerian civilization is not a mystery to be solved by archaeology alone. It is a record to be read. The transition from Ubaid villages to Sumerian cities is not a leap but a handover. The moment the Anunnaki began delegating operations to the species they had made. The flood is not a myth, but an event, one that precipitated the departure and left humanity to manage on its own. The timeline of the early civilization, the sudden appearance of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent around 9500 BCE, the abrupt urbanization of southern Mesopotamia around 3500 BCE, the invention of writing within a few centuries of that urbanization, is not a series of happy accidents. It is a schedule. Each capability appears when it appears because that is when the capability was transferred, and the transfers accelerated as the departure approached. The final centuries of the third millennium, BCE, the period of the Ur-3 dynasty, the last great Sumerian state, would then represent the end of the transition, the last generation in which even residual divine oversight was available. After that, the humans were on their own. The laments began, and the silence of the academic establishment is not neutral. It is a choice, a decision to leave a specific and testable reading unexamined, because the implications of examining it are professionally unacceptable. That last point is the one the audience of this channel returns to most often. Not the ancient texts, not the artifacts, the silence, the unwillingness to engage, the preference for characterization over refutation, the fact that 50 years of best-selling books, hundreds of millions of video views, and a global audience numbering in the tens of millions have not produced a single, comprehensive, academic counter-reading of the specific Sumerian passages Sitchin identified. The question that has not been answered seriously is not, were the Anunnaki real? The question that has not been answered seriously is, why has no one published a comprehensive counter-reading of the specific textual features Sitchin identified? That question has been open for 50 years. It is still open. The Atrahasis tablets are in the British Museum. They have been there since the 19th century, since the crates arrived from the excavations in Mesopotamia. Fragments of clay carried across the desert and the sea to a gallery in Bloomsbury, where they sit behind glass in carefully controlled humidity. W. G. Lambert and A. R. Millard published their translation in 1969. Zecharia Sitchin published his in 1976. Both readings are available. Both rely on the same broken tablets, with the same wedge-shaped impressions pressed into the same clay 3,700 years ago. What the conventional reading does not explain, what it has never attempted to explain in a published peer-reviewed forum, is why the text describes creation as a procedure, departure as a bureaucratic event, and the abandonment of a species as a consequence of design rather than a failure of compassion. The tablets are available to any researcher who wants to check. The Well-Blundell prism is in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. The king list is on the prism, the numbers are on the king list. The question of what those numbers mean, and why the rains shorten after the flood, and why the beings who once held kingship are described as leaving. That question has been open since Stephen Langdon published the prism in 1923. It is still open now,